Toto, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Our conversation today is important because in many ways you symbolize the concept behind this show, Cars and Culture. You have a career that's currently built around the success of the sport, obviously connected to motor racing and the passion of the car, in this sense, a racing car. But the smell, the excitement, and the energy, all of that, I think, Toto, first led you to the sport and ultimately brought you back and created this latest installment of your own career. But you're also significantly about culture. And you're an enormous student and a proponent of culture. You live it, you cultivate it, modify it, celebrate it. Both kind of go hand in hand, don't they?
Yeah, yes, they do. At the end, culture is the immune system of a sports team or any company. So as it is most often seen as a soft factor, not contributing directly to an organization's performance, especially not a technical or engineering organization where everything is measured in data, that gives us opportunity and gives us an advantage over our direct competitors.
And you spend a lot of time focusing on culture on a regular basis, probably as much time as you do thinking about the business of sport.
I think culture encompasses everything in an organization. You can say that attention to detail, passion, energy, empowerment, a no-blame culture. I mean, I could name you 10 other values that are important, are literally so important in terms of making an organization more resilient that as a leader, you just have to study that, and you just have to continue to develop and build the culture of any organization.
Are there those who you've crossed paths with, who you admire from a cultural standpoint or even from a business standpoint?
I think everybody does it in a way different. Most important is that you understand what is it that you can personally contribute to an organization, and about being authentic. And that's why there will be many different forms of culture and leadership philosophies among people that are lucky enough to head organizations. My personal one is based on the fact that I believe we're in a specialist's world. Doesn't mean you're a one-trick pony, but you need to understand your business and the sport inside out. That's number one. Number two, I believe that empathy, it's a word that's being too often used these days, but empathy is incredibly important, because I cannot develop an aerodynamic surface, but I can know everything about the people that do, and build a framework around them with the right amount of resource and the motivating incentives, and try to keep them in a good space, and that will contribute to a team's and department's performance.
Let's start with the nexus of cars and culture to illustrate maybe some of those points that you just said, because your team's recent experience on the track in the last few days may exemplify probably you and your philosophy really well, kind of illustrative of everything that we're going to cover here during our time on the show. And we're talking just days after Formula One's return to the Monaco Grand Prix for the first time in 2 years. There, of course, was no Monaco Grand Prix in 2020, and as F1 adjusted around the COVID calendar. But the return to Monaco was important and a significant milestone for Formula One, and I believe it was likely a learning landmark for the team. You obviously, throughout the course of the 7-time championship efforts that you've been able to put together with the team, we're not happy with what has been described as one of the worst days in recent memory on the track. And you took to social media directly afterwards, and you had a message for the Instagram world. Why was it important for you to talk so publicly about what you were going to learn?
The moment you lose, you will have a whole array of emotions that go through your mind and through your soul. And if you are a competitor, it will be anger, frustration, trying to release your pressure on someone. That is the easiest way of actually blaming anybody else. It kind of helps you to get over it. And it's very difficult to act differently. And for me, it is almost a matter of discipline to be able, whilst being in all that pain and suffering, to express a neutral view of what has happened. And part of that is to say, okay, I know what to do. I know that mistakes have been done. I know that we haven't prepared in the right way. But I also know that these will be learnings necessary to progress. And that's why I was utilizing this particular channel to send a message into the organization. That's the most important channel that I have in terms of applying the right amount of pressure whilst energizing and motivating everybody that can contribute to future performances.
You've said in the past that there's more pain in losing than joy in winning, and that in fact, it keeps you on your toes. You also say that bad races keep you awake for a few days. So maybe the first question is, have you slept in a few days?
I'm getting better at it. In the past, it would be really, we could measure it. I shared experiences with Lewis Hamilton, our driver. And losing is about 4 days within you, and it causes pain and distress and lack of sleep. And winning is actually the joy and happiness of winning is gone by Monday morning, bizarrely. So we are little animals, but I think it comes out of our philosophy, and that is seeing the glass half empty rather than half full. Because half empty means that you can really point the finger on the things that didn't function well, whilst having actually dominated or won on the track. And this is why I'm always skeptical about whether we are really good enough, whether we can sort ourselves out for the next race or the next championship, whilst the joy is always limited to that very fear that we just lucked out. Is a little bit of an imposter syndrome that we all have.
Sure. You also live by the concept of resiliency. And to your point, remembering that when you face a difficult moment, it's your opportunity to grow and develop and get stronger. You're an Austrian. You have to ski when you're born in Austria. And it's kind of like skiing, and it's a perfect analogy for resiliency, right? Staying balanced, going headstrong into a moment that requires some resiliency. That's your view, isn't it?
Pretty much the only sport where Austrians are number one on a, let's say, global perspective. But staying balanced is generally important for all life, not only whilst skiing downhill. I think it is about keeping perspective, not being narrowed down in your emotions and reactions by your brain, not allowing the emotional part of your brain, the amygdala, to take over, but literally consciously trying to be in the rational part of the brain. And you can actively tackle that. And with discipline and time, you can keep yourself just in a better frame of mind.
When you develop resiliency in an adverse environment, it's also useful later on. I want to go back to something that you once said to someone. You said that your experience with high-performing individuals, that very last percentage of high performers, is that they either suffered trauma or humiliation or both, because what would justify to develop the above average drive and ambition? You're one of the most successful racing team principals in Formula One history, but you had your own trauma as a child. Can you tell me a little bit about your upbringing and what happened with your father?
I think what I said is not the, let's say, universal truth, but I see that the majority of people that I interact, that go that extra percent, that are prepared to take some pain, have had experiences that you could say were in that corner. And I wish every child to grow up in a safe environment. And there's plenty of people out there that have been exceptionally successful in whatever business or art they were involved in. So it is about being able to channel the negative emotions that you have suffered from into positivity and into energy. And when you try to overcompensate the humiliations that you had as a child, the trauma and pain that you had as a child, it just gives you that extra dimension, that extra force to do well and to be successful. And I think that is almost in your later life an advantage that you have. But it's yin and yang. It comes with the downsides that you had in a previous part of your life.
You grew up in Vienna to a Polish mother and a Romanian father. Interestingly, went to a French school, which you have credited with helping you out along the way. But your father was diagnosed with brain cancer when you were 8 years old. Your parents separated following his diagnosis, and unfortunately, he passed away some 10 years later. How did that shape you?
Well, that is my personal trauma, that I had a dying parent from my very early childhood to the end of my puberty. So it affected me, and this is what I am today. A hardworking mother that tried to keep us afloat financially, whilst at the same time being in a private school that we could barely afford, and being exposed to an environment where privileged children were. So that's actually the worst of both places. If you're in a poor neighborhood, you kind of never see yourself mediocre because you're part of that environment. But what I have seen was very different to the life I could afford, I could live. And that's why I can remember very early in my life, I must have been around 9 or 10, that I wanted to be responsible for myself. I wanted to be responsible for my family and look after them, rather than being a child that was dependent from anybody else. So the downside is that these emotions still make me suffer occasionally, but also are a very strong driver. I want to have my family in a better place that I was raised, but not. I couldn't identify any wrongdoing from my parents. It's just how things happened.
And the psychological impact had to be enormous.
The psychological impact was enormous. I mean, little things. You're coming home, you have a very ill father. I remember one instance when I must have been 13 years old. So it's the moment you become a little person, that I was being called out of class after the lunch break, and I was being led down to the headmaster's office. And there sat my 10-year-old sister, and the headmaster, he said it straight into our face that we need to leave school because, again, the school fee isn't paid. So I had to walk up back to the classroom, pick up my little backpack, whilst my stupid friends were saying, "Oh, you're so lucky, you can go home." But it was the biggest humiliation that I have suffered. And in the way home, in a 45-minute tram ride with my sister, I had to explain to this 10-year-old girl why we had to leave school. And as you can imagine, this is something you never want to expose any child to. Now you can say, okay, it was in a private school and there's much worse problem than that. But you're always in your own reality. And that was a painful exercise, or that was a painful experience for me.
Yeah. Resiliency. At 17, you joined a friend, and all of a sudden you were at the Nürburgring watching a Formula 3 race, and you saw what you described as modern gladiators on the track, and you got bit by the bug, the racing bug. But you had a hard time financing that, and you had a very creative idea. What was your idea for trying to be able to afford the opportunity to start racing?
Racing was a tool for me to kind of shape my own future. In my environment, there wasn't a lot of professional sports, and there wasn't anybody racing because my friend lived in Switzerland. And so I started to get really interested and went to a racing school. Wasn't the worst one there, and started
Walter
to
Lechner,
get in,
right? Walter
Walter
Lechner.
Lechner. Yeah, that was at I see maybe in continental Europe with the Jim Russell Racing School, the most renowned one. Won my course and got a little bit of a budget from the racing team to race in single seaters, and then I figured out there's still a big gap to what I needed for a full season, and so I started to speak to all the parents that I knew from my friends in school. And interestingly, I raised some sponsorship. I made the whole presentation myself. I went there, put my best suit and tie on, and eventually had the budget together for a, let's say, a small little season. And that was very important to see for me, because actually driving is one thing, but as a 17 or 18-year-old to raise money and understand that it's very difficult was an important part of my development for my future career.
But I'm guessing that experience early on helped you get beyond the previous experience that we just discussed. You had a little bit of a pathway to something that was much brighter.
Yes, because motor racing made me stand out from the group. There wasn't really anything that would have allowed me to be something better. And motor racing was so different that I felt more together with the sport.
I also like the story that you said, well, make this my Christmas gift, my birthday gift, my next Christmas gift, and my next birthday gift, 4 gifts into one to pay for racing school. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. My mother worked as a doctor for a state-owned hospital, and her salary would barely take us through a month. So I got her and my grandfather to basically put all future gifts together in this one racing school week, and they did it. I was able to convince them, and that was the start of my racing.
So racing ultimately leads to the next incarnation and a little more resiliency when they tell you in 1994 that you're not going to be a racer and the sponsorships are maybe not there. Of course, I think the death of Ayrton Senna, you have said, led to a lot of that second thoughts, if you will, on the sponsorship side. So now you end up on the trading floor of a bank in Warsaw. More resiliency. You've gone from racing to finance. And what did you learn there? Well, first, let me ask you, Toto, what you had to have missed the track. All of a sudden now you're in your suit and tie on a permanent basis.
Yes, it was a less enjoyable experience. I cried my eyes out when I was alone and couldn't believe that suddenly I was sitting in an investment bank as a trainee when everybody else was on racing tracks, driving cars, which I adored. But Ayrton Senna's death shut the opportunities for me for future single-seater racing, because my main sponsor decided to pull out. So it was clear it came to a natural end. And I also felt that I lacked the background in go-karting, and I wouldn't be a Formula One world champion, probably. And that's why when it happened, I said to myself, okay, let's utilize this opportunity. Let's be the youngest successful investment banker. All my friends were either studying or traveling, and I started to work, the first of the group. And my frustration at the beginning quickly changed into motivation and enjoyment that I was earning my own money.
And a competitive spirit that was just taken to a different arena. And all of a sudden you catch a wave on the internet boom that was occurring. You went to America for a short stint and understood what was happening with companies like AOL and Netscape and business that was in America could be possibly transformed to the European business community. And now all of a sudden you have your own legitimate business that's going, and that had to be hugely satisfying.
It was, because what started as equity for consulting developed into a real little investment and venture capital firm. In the German-speaking countries, we did well, and I got some satisfaction out of that, because from an employee with a salary, I transitioned to an entrepreneur. And because there was a real opportunity back in the day to a situation where I could afford to pay for my mother's and my sister's life and have reserves, myself be able to afford a better life for all of us. And then the company grew. We had offices in Vienna, Berlin, Zurich, Tel Aviv, Warsaw. And my ambition that went from motor racing went into venture capital. And I forgot about motor racing for 10 years. Until
you didn't, until you came back to it.
Yeah, until I didn't. And but that was more like a hobby, and with still the same ambition to be as fast and as competitive as the pros. And I tried a little bit of prototype racing, GT cars, touring cars, and then went into rallying because it was the intellectually more stimulant activity. Being able to combine analysis and intellect whilst still taking risks in a kind of controlled way. And this also shaped my philosophy in the investment banking or venture capital way. If you can live with the worst outcome, you can take the risk. If you can't, don't go there.
And tell us how you got then connected with Formula One.
When stepping back into a racing environment, I saw that there was young talent that were in a similar situation to mine, couldn't really afford to race. And I started to help these kids out. First, just in an angel investor form, and then with a professional management company. And whilst doing that, I established connections to auto companies and joined forces. And Mercedes was one of them. And we had a Mercedes Junior program that was half financed by myself and half financed by Mercedes. And then one day, I find myself as a co-owner of a Mercedes racing team. And we grew that entity to solid mid-size company that was involved in making Formula 3 engines, touring cars, GT cars, limited road cars for AMG. And that was basically combining my love for cars, particularly racing cars, and investments.
You had to have been extremely thrilled to be coming full circle to some extent, in the sense that, you know, if you go back more than a decade prior, this was where the passion was. This was what you really wanted to experience. And now you had the chance to make a mark in a different area. Of course, you weren't in the seat, but you were combining your business acumen and experience and translating that into the track to some extent.
Yes, and it was an interesting experience that I made that made me realize. Now, let me word it differently. I wasn't aware that it went all the way back to racing, and I invested in an auto company heavily involved in motor racing, and we IPO'd it. And as the business model was for venture capital firms, I exited the company in the IPO, and we sold a majority stake to a Middle Eastern investor. And I remained on the board as a non-executive and went to one of the races and realized I'd actually like to continue to own this company. And realized that my passion for investing and exiting, generating cash, actually changed to a desire for a more entrepreneurial role because I love the sport.
And by 2012, Mercedes-Benz needs a managing partner. It wants somebody with skin in the game. It wants to change the structure of its own Formula One team. And so here comes another opportunity. One that
there was a step in between. The step in between was that I bought a stake in Williams Formula One team. Williams is one of the most successful historic, racing teams, with Frank Williams at the helm of it, team principal in a wheelchair, highly inspiring person. And I bought a minority share in Williams, grew the stake. And in 2012, our chief executive officer resigned from one day to the other because of a non-alignment with the board. And Frank Williams approached me and said, "Do you want to run it with me together?" And here I find myself for the first time in an executive function running the team, and I loved it. That season we won the last Formula One race for Williams until today, and I enjoyed taking the team to the next level. And then the same year, Mercedes approached me and said, "How can it be that a private team like Williams is starting to beat Mercedes on track? Can you analyze?" And I tried as good as I could to understand. They allowed me access whilst keeping it confidential, and I came to the conclusion that their expectations were different to mine. We operated on the same budget, and when I asked the directors of Mercedes what their objectives were, they said, "Well, winning the world championship." And I said, "But then one of us is wrong, because I'm operating on the same budget, and my expectation is finishing in the top 5. Yours is to win. So you gotta set your targets more realistically." And this is when we started a conversation that eventually ended up in me buying 30% of the team and running it.
And for you, how pivotal was that moment in your career path? How much did that? Maybe how significant was it for you to make that kind of change?
It was very significant, because that is the moment I decided to switch from a purely investment-like philosophy, because you could see the transitional year with Williams I saw it as a transitional year that eventually I would come back into finance. But then I took an operational role, and I liked it. it was entrepreneurial because I co-owned the team. Daimler gave me a very long leash so I could manage a team in a way that I thought was right, whilst providing me with the right support of this mighty brand Mercedes in the background. And pretty soon we started to become more successful. And since then I enjoyed the ride.
So here we sit some 8, almost 9 years later. Somebody asked you once whether it had been, when it was 5 years, whether it had been a long 5 years. And you said it had been a long 5 years. So now it's 8 years. Has it been a long 8 years?
It has been a long 8 years that today feel much less long than they felt 2 years ago when I was asked the question. And in between, whilst running the team, I had a year of reflection. COVID, in a way, came at the right time for me in terms of my professional career, because suddenly it made us all jump out of the hamster wheel. Rather than going from race to race, from continent to continent, we were all confined in a place. And I asked myself a question: do you want to continue owning this team and running it and making it a integrated sports entity, very successful, or would I want to go back in more diversified investment activity? And I came to the conclusion, and it took me 10 months, that this was the space I wanted to stay, whilst acknowledging that there will be a time in my life, and that is not too far away, that I will step aside to allow the next generation running the team whilst staying on as a shareholder or as a chairman.
So stepping out of the day-to-day and more of the observational and tutoring and teaching.
Yeah, stepping off the dance floor and spending more time on the balcony. But then I know myself, I try to understand what is going on and to a certain degree also have control. And control doesn't necessarily mean that I need to micromanage. Control can also be allowing mistakes, but being aware of them, allowing the new management, a younger generation, to make mistakes, but knowing what is going on. And that is something that I see as necessary, because this job you can't do forever. I spent 250 nights in hotels, 700 hours in an airplane. You suffer from jet lag, and you're not seeing your family enough. And it is basically that work-life balance isn't something that as a concept exists anymore. It's just all work, non-stop, 24/7. Mm. And I don't believe that you can stay as effective for a long time as you've been when you started the job.
So you're in your, if I can use the racing analogy, you're in your sort of final laps, if you will, metaphorically.
A final lap sounds like, a coach that's retiring, and that is not my situation. Final chapters, maybe as a team principal, literally running all aspects of the organization. But I've decided, together with Mercedes, to commit for the long term, stay on as a shareholder, and we will all remain in charge of the team long term.
You've had the wonderful experience of being connected to two dynamic individuals, both of whom I'd like to ask you about. One is, of course, Lewis Hamilton, who you describe as one of the greatest race car drivers of his generation, but also Niki Lauda. So let's focus on Niki first. He was actually the cousin of your ex-wife. He was in your family.
Yeah, but I didn't get to know him before. It was an interesting coincidence that we ended up in the same sport. I was a non-executive at Williams, like I mentioned to you before, and he was a TV present commentator. And So we started to travel together, but the relationship wasn't particularly close. And when Mercedes asked me to buy a stake in the team, they just hired Niki Lauda as a non-executive chairman. And when we agreed the deal, they said to me, there's one slight problem, you got to tell Niki. And I said, well, didn't you tell him? And I said, no, we'd actually like you to work with him and inform him. And I saw him in Brazil and said, just to tell you, I've bought 40% in the team. And he said, okay, that comes as a surprise. Let me think about it overnight. And like Niki is, it didn't take overnight. He came back to see me an hour later and said, okay, I think together we can be more successful than me on my own. And I think you're a good investor. So from the 40%, I'd like to take 10% with in the same structure like you did, same terms and conditions. And here we go. I had 30%, he had 10. He was the non-executive chairman and I was the chief executive officer and team principal.
But you needed to come to a common understanding on a couple of things. And there was a famous Stuttgart airport conversation that you had. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, at the beginning, each of us tried to protect his area. And for him, I was a finance guy and he was the racing guy. And we often didn't share opinion. And it became quite distracting to have that internal fight. And eventually the Daimler board said, well, we can't continue like that. And they called us to Stuttgart and say, we'd like you two to run it. Niki, you're non-executive. You should let Toto run it operationally. And he said, that's when I realized that we could do it together, but in split functions. And I said to him, I'd rather have you on board, but you need to understand that your role is non-executive, but it can be so impactful. Your sheer presence gives us strengths. And then our relationship changed from a purely professional situation into friendship. And over the years, with all our traveling, because we used to travel just the two of us, and literally spending every dinner together, talking about motor racing, which we were both 100% focused on, we found out that even in our spare time, we wanted to spend time with each other and talk about motor racing. And there's a funny anecdote that we have this mandatory summer break for 2.5 weeks. And I was with my family in a hotel in Sardinia. And I have a missed call at 6:30 in the morning and then another one at 7:30. So I called him back and he says, I took the boat right in front of your hotel. I was in Spain, decided to come to Sardinia, and I'm sitting in the breakfast place, having on my second espresso. Can you please come down so we can have a chat? And I opened the windows and I saw his boat literally 100 meters offshore. And I said, I can't believe it. You're stalking me now in my holidays. But to be honest, it's just what I like to have too.
You miss him every day, right?
I miss him every day. I miss him every day. He was my closest friend at the end over many years. And so much that I learned from him. And he was just an exceptional personality. The ability at the age of 70 to still be open to new experiences, learn, accept that you're not perfect, or accept that we're all imperfect. And there's another funny story that he was a very, very experienced pilot. He had over 10,000 hours. So we were approaching Tokyo in a typhoon. His two pilots were operating the aircraft, and Niki and I sat in the cabin. And thunderstorms, lightnings, big turbulence. And suddenly Niki gets up and goes to the front, barely making it with the turbulence. And I can see that he's giving them a hard time. So he's coming back and I said, what happened? And he says, they are stupid idiots. And I said, why are they stupid idiots? I said, well, whilst we are flying through this weather, they started to balance the the plane by pumping fuel from one side to the other. And that's absolutely not necessary when in such a, let's say, a critical situation. So I said to him, whilst the plane is bouncing left, right, and center, do you think it helped the situation that you, Niki Lauda, owner of the aircraft, goes to the front, gives the two pilots a bollocking, and you walk back? Do you think that makes the situation safer? And he said, well, what would you have done? I said, well, I would have written down what they've done. And in a briefing after the flight, I would have said, that wasn't the right thing to do. Please consider that for future flights. And he said, no, that's not how I operate. I just needed to get it off the chest because I would, I just need to get the pressure off. He said, well, that's your problem. And many months later, similar situation, we're flying into LA, big turbulence. And I see him taking out a tiny little notepad from his jacket and a pen, and he's starting to write. And I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm still able to learn even in my old age. I'm writing stuff down that I need to tell the pilots after we've landed. So he was just an amazing personality. And because I was so close, I forgot that he was the 3-time Formula One world champion, a driver that stepped out of the fire and survived, came back, won another championship, created his own airline, extremely successful. And here we go. He was my friend, and he was nothing else than Niki, and a very close ally of Susie, my wife, and I.
And a very influential part of Lewis Hamilton's life. So your two worlds kind of connecting there, with the two of them. And I want to ask you about Lewis. What is it that most people wouldn't know about Lewis?
The person you see in the media is very often somebody completely different when you know them personally. And our judgment can be misleading. And what you see from Lewis is this polarizing, exceptionally talented racing driver, interested in fashion, music, and you could say almost somebody that is perfect. But the truth is there's someone behind that went through a lot of suffering as well, exposed to racism as a young child. Someone very empathetic, highly intelligent, reflective ability to have this self introspection, and someone that thrives to be better every day. And that is something that I haven't seen before meeting him. That the reason he is a 7-time world champion is that he questions himself every day. Even after the most successful performances, he still finds areas of weaknesses and gaps. And that is not only in a racing car, but it's also outside of the racing car. We have had a very difficult situation in 2016 where our communication broke down. And after months or so, I reached out to him and said, listen, we got to talk, because you're driving the car. I own the team and run it. So he came to see me in Oxford. We had a kitchen talk for many hours. And what I said to him is that we will very often have different perceptions and opinions, and you just need to acknowledge and understand that the person opposite you has a different point of view, has a different way of perceiving their own reality, and maybe different objectives. But when understanding that, we can actually move on from it, agree to disagree, or find a way forward that functions. But at the end, we share the joint objectives. I want you to be Drivers' World Championship, and you want us to be the most successful team. So whilst sharing the same objective, there will always be more in common than what will split us. And I said to him, I'm often having conversations with my wife that we have an argument like in any other relationship, but I have never thought about divorce. So I don't want to divorce you because I couldn't imagine anybody else more talented in my car. And I guess that you don't want to leave the best team. So we have to just find solution. We have to communicate, even if it is awkward or painful. And in those many years, I've found myself in situations where I actually decided to not speak because I was upset. And it turned around. He became the more mature person, although I'm like 10 years older. And he said, "You forgot, we need to talk." And that is fascinating to just be part of a journey of probably one of the most successful sports icons in the world.
Who is skeptical, I want to go back to the word that you used at the start of this conversation, skeptical about his own performance. You've even described yourself as being skeptical about the team's performance. I mean, this is a philosophy that's shared.
Absolutely. And I think we had that before we met. Doubting in yourself, questioning your performances, be it in the car or be it from the pit wall where I am is something which we have in common and which makes us contributing to the team's development and the team's performance. And we have this pattern now that Sunday evening, arriving at home, we would always speak to each other and we would never talk about what was good, only what was not good enough. And the dialogue continues until the next race.
I want to ask you about leadership. You have said that you want people around you who tell you no. Pushback is a good thing. Trust is established through that kind of feedback, similar to what you've just shared. How important is that to you about having those around you with dissenting opinions, rather?
The more successful you become, the less you will get honest feedback. People are dependent of you, people financially or emotionally. People will look up to you, will not question you, will be scared of your authority. And what you need to establish around you is actually in your private life and in your professional life, a way that people can give you honest feedback. And that means creating a safe environment. And that will very often be quite uncomfortable. If you're hearing things, you're self-confident in what you do, success is happening, and then somebody's telling you that you behaved like an idiot, or you weren't prepared enough, or you shouldn't be late to meetings and disrespecting their time. That's one example that was given to you. And we took it to another level, and 360 degrees management performance meetings now don't take place in an anonymous way. And people can send in their feedback, but we do it like the anonymous alcoholics in a circle with all my peers and all my direct reports, and everything is out in the open. And that is a difficult ride to hear it in an open group.
I can imagine.
But it made me progress as an individual. And it created an environment where there is not only admiration, but there is criticism. And that is so important for my own personal development. And of course, going home, my wife is my maybe biggest supporter, but also my biggest critic.
What have you learned about yourself in those meetings?
The initial emotional reaction is pushback. No, that's not true. You are wrong. Or an explanation why that happened. And then you step back and you find out actually there's some truth. And even if for yourself you didn't perceive that situation to be negative, in someone else's perception it was. So you got to decide, is this something I need to change because I haven't realized, or is this something I need to change because someone else felt that way? And that's quite interesting.
Setting goals is an enormously important aspect of what you do. You talk about it a lot. Targets are very important. And also writing down those targets. And I think you have an exercise where you still within the team have those goals and targets, external goals or internal goals, laminated. Each person carries them with you. You told a story once about sort of finding that little piece of laminated paper while searching for something in your iPod on an overseas trip, and noticing whether or not you had achieved the goals or whether you were on the path to achieving those goals. It is so crucial to your success, right?
I think when we talk about it now, it sounds almost a little bit trivial. Everybody talks now about setting goals. The truth is, it's one, if not the most important part of my own development. If you set yourself objectives, you spend time trying to find out what makes you happy, you will establish a blueprint of that situation. You can almost imagine yourself of being in that space. And that is extremely powerful because we create it. We actually create our own path, and we create the target. And writing it down by hand creates another pathway in your brain to make it a reality. And what we have done in the team is that we are asking all members to spend time to analyze what their targets are. And it can be personal targets, be a better father or a good husband, lose some weight, but also your department's targets and the company's targets. And everybody buys into this, let's say, from a company's objectives point of view. And then we laminate that in a little leaflet, and everybody has that in his briefcase or in a backpack. And occasionally you stumble upon, and I do it very regularly. This morning, I couldn't sleep, and I took the laminate out and looked at it and reflected. And particularly after last week's negative race, it was a good way to remember where I wanted to end this year.
See, that's what I said about Monaco, right? You wouldn't sleep for a few days. I knew there was something in there.
It's still there. It's not 4 days are not gone yet. From tomorrow onwards, it's going to get better.
Speaking of targets, Toto, you will have some would say, a significant birthday, the early part of next year. One with a round number.
Don't say that. It's a terrible number.
It's a number that I will have 1 month before you.
Okay.
It is halftime, you have said, in an entrepreneurial life. So what's your target for the next 20 or 30 years? Where do we take it from here?
It's funny. I don't care about birthdays. I forget about my own. The only ones I really know is my wife and my 3 children. And birthdays, I don't understand why that is a festive day. You're getting older. You had no particular contribution to your birth. So what are you actually celebrating? So it was never of any importance. But I remember when I decided to launch my own company or start up my own company, I was proud to being called the youngest entrepreneur in my environment, and then that kind of image of myself followed me a long time. And now I'm 49 years old, and as you say, I'm going to be 50 in January. And it's like, hold on a minute, you're not young anymore. People expect you, and I expect myself to be successful in my prime business days, and it's kind of, you're losing the innocence. And at the age of 15, but innocence from a playful side, in a way. At least that was my perception when I was young. And now I feel myself still very young, and I see myself developing and being still playful and cheeky. So I'm just about to reinvent my concept of being 50 plus because of my current self. That's quite interesting. But 50 doesn't sound anywhere young anymore. And yeah, God knows how many good summers I have left.
Well, let's certainly hope that you have good weekends on the racetrack, because we want you to sleep well and move to that 50th year in good speed. Toto, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. There's good weekends are important, but there's so much more that you can take joy from outside of your professional life. And I think it's important to keep that perspective, that there's more than sporting or financial success, and that gives you the right perspective and takes pressure off you for your main activity. But thank you for having me.
You have taught us about cars and culture. We appreciate that. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Jason.
The automobile is one of the most important inventions that revolutionized the modern world. In America, the rich history of car culture runs deep as technology continues to shape the future of the industry. Jason Stein,
former publisher of Automotive News,
is here to share the stories of people passionate about cars, from industry leaders and innovators to car-obsessed celebrities. Buckle up as Jason takes you inside the boardroom, onto the track, and around the bend on Cars and Culture on SiriusXM Business Radio.